Someone hands you something in a clay vessel. It's warm. It smells strange, sweet, a little sour, faintly rotten. You drink it anyway. Within the hour, the world feels different. Softer. Your shoulders drop. The fear that has been sitting behind your eyes for 3 days, the hunger, the cold, the sounds outside the cave, quiets down. Your brain releases a flood of dopamine, that ancient chemical reward that your nervous system has been chasing since before you had a word for it. You didn't know what fermentation was. You didn't know what alcohol was. You just knew that this felt good, and you wanted more. Here is what most people assume. Alcohol is a modern problem, a product of civilization, excess, and weakness, something your ancestors never had to deal with. Here is what the archaeological record actually says. Your ancestors were getting drunk at least 10,000 years before the first city was ever built. Possibly longer. The story of prehistoric intoxication is not a story about weakness. It is a story about the human brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. Seek pleasure, reduce pain, and bond with other humans. And it turns out, fermented liquid helped with all three. Let's go back to the beginning. Fermentation does not require human intelligence. It requires fruit, water, time, and wild yeast, a microscopic organism that exists on the skin of almost every piece of fruit on Earth. When fruit falls from a tree and sits on the ground, wild yeast begins consuming its sugars and producing alcohol as a byproduct. This is not a human invention. It is a chemical reaction that has been happening on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. Long before your ancestors existed, animals were consuming fermented fruit and experiencing the effects. Elephants in Africa have been documented actively seeking out fermented marula fruit. Fruit flies are hardwired to prefer food that contains ethanol. The monarch butterfly uses fermented plant material during migration. Your attraction to alcohol is not a flaw. It is a biological inheritance shared across the animal kingdom. So when did your ancestors first intentionally produce alcohol rather than simply stumble across it? The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional fermentation comes from a site in northern Jordan called Rockefet Cave, excavated by researchers from the University of Haifa. Inside this 13,000-year-old cave, archaeologist Li Liu and her team discovered stone mortars, large grinding basins carved into the cave floor. Chemical residue analysis of these mortars revealed the presence of fermented plant material, including wheat, barley, and tubers. This was not accidental. The grinding, the soaking, the storage, it required deliberate knowledge and deliberate effort. 13,000 years ago, before the plow, before pottery as we know it, before most of what we call civilization. But that finding, as remarkable as it is, may not even be the oldest. In southeastern Turkey, there is a site that has fundamentally changed how we understand prehistoric human behavior. It is called Göbekli Tepe. It was built roughly 11,600 years ago, making it the oldest known monumental structure on Earth, predating Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years. The people who built it were hunter-gatherers. They had no permanent settlements. They had no writing, no metal, no wheels. And yet they built massive stone pillars, carved with intricate animal reliefs, arranged in precise circular formations. The scale of this construction required coordinating hundreds of workers over generations. Archaeologist Brian Hayden, who has spent decades studying the economics of feasting in prehistoric societies, argues that sites like Göbekli Tepe could not have been built without fermented beverages. Not because the workers were drunk, but because alcohol was the economic glue. It was what you offered people in exchange for their labor. It was the reward that made cooperation possible at scale. And the physical evidence supports this. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe have uncovered large stone vessels, some capable of holding up to 160 liters, with chemical residues consistent with fermented grain beverages. Someone was brewing in enormous quantities. Someone was hosting. This is where the economics become fascinating. Your prehistoric ancestors did not have money. They did not have a universal medium of exchange. What they had was a gift economy layered over a reciprocal exchange system. You gave something valuable, and the social obligation to return that value, not immediately, but eventually, was what held communities together. Fermented beverages were extraordinarily valuable in this system. They required rare knowledge to produce. They required time. They required surplus grain or fruit, which was itself scarce. And they produced a social effect. Relaxation, bonding, reduced aggression, that was worth paying for. Biochemist Patrick McGovern, who runs the Biomolecular Archaeology Project at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, has spent his career analyzing the chemical residues left inside ancient vessels. His work has found evidence of fermented beverages, mixtures of grape, hawthorn fruit, honey, and rice, in Chinese pottery dating back 9,000 years. He has found proto-beer residues in Egyptian vessels from 3,500 BCE. He has traced the chemical fingerprints of ancient wine across the Caucasus region as far back as 6,000 BCE. His conclusion, stated plainly, the desire to alter consciousness through fermented substances is one of the most ancient and universal human behaviors we can document. So let's reconstruct what actually happened. It is roughly 10,000 BCE. You are part of a band of 20 to 30 people moving through a landscape that is slowly warming as the last ice age retreats. Your group has stopped for several weeks near a reliable water source. Someone, probably a woman, since women were historically the primary fermentation specialists in most early cultures, has been experimenting. She noticed that grain left soaking in water for several days produces a liquid that smells different, that when you drink it, something shifts. She has learned to control this. She knows roughly how long to soak the grain. She knows that warmth speeds the process. She knows that certain vessels work better than others when a neighboring group arrives, perhaps for a seasonal gathering, a marriage negotiation, a trade of tools or animal skins. She produces this liquid. It is offered in the largest vessel available. People drink. The tension that always exists between unfamiliar groups begins to dissolve. Someone starts drumming. Someone tells a story. The negotiation that might have taken 3 days of careful maneuvering happens in one evening around a fire. This is not a trivial detail. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar, famous for his work on the evolution of social bonding, has argued that the neural pathways activated by alcohol, specifically the release of endorphins, are the same pathways activated by laughter, music, and physical touch. Alcohol, in other words, hacks the social bonding system of the human brain. It produces, artificially and rapidly, the feeling of trust and closeness that normally takes weeks of shared experience to develop. In a world where your survival depended on the size and reliability of your social network, this was not a luxury. This was a strategic tool, and people were willing to pay for it. Here is the counterintuitive twist that archaeologists have been arguing about for decades. Some researchers now believe that the desire for fermented beverages, not the need for food, may have been what drove the agricultural revolution. This is called the beer before bread hypothesis, and it was first formally proposed by archaeologists Jonathan Brower and Robert Braidwood in the 1950 Mans. The argument is this. Wild grain is nutritionally adequate as food without being processed. You can eat it raw or pound it into rough flour. But to make beer, you need to grow enough grain to have a surplus. You need to stay in one place long enough to tend and harvest it. You need to build storage vessels large enough to hold the fermented liquid. In other words, the logistical requirements of large-scale fermentation may have been a primary driver of early settlement, domestication of crops, and the beginning of what we call civilization. We built the world to feed our craving. The evidence is not conclusive. Most archaeologists believe alcohol and bread developed together, each reinforcing the other. But the beer before bread hypothesis has never been disproven, and the sheer scale of fermentation vessels found at early agricultural sites suggests that brewing was not an afterthought. It was central. What did prehistoric humans pay to get drunk? Not money. That came later. They paid in labor, in animal skins, in flint tools, in social obligation, in the agreement to return the favor when your neighbor needed something valuable. Sound familiar? You pay for a drink at a bar with currency that represents your labor. You offer a bottle of wine to a host and accept the unspoken social obligation it creates. You use alcohol to smooth over a difficult conversation, to celebrate a success, to bond with strangers at a work event. The mechanism is identical, only the medium of exchange has changed. Your brain does not know that 10,000 years have passed. It still responds to ethanol the same way it responded in that cave in Jordan. It still releases endorphins when social bonds feel secure. It still lowers the activation energy required to trust another person. You are not a modern person with an ancient weakness. You are an ancient creature who happens to be living in a modern world. And that clay vessel, warm in someone's hands around a fire 10,000 years ago, is not as far from your Friday evening as you think. Someone handed your ancestors something. They drank it anyway. So did you.